So we need to kind of briefly talk about how we actually communicate about web design, right? What are some of the terms associated with web design that you might not find in, say, flat design or print and publication or even in app design, right? These are all just a little bit different, and so we need to kind of reorient our thinking from, let's say, film or from animation or from, like I said before, publication or advertising, and kind of resituate ourselves in this world of web design. So one of the basic things that we can talk about, which is pretty similar to print publication, is layout, right? Every web page has a kind of layout and hierarchy that's created through text and content. So, for instance, we have a background, right? The background image. We have the actual text and the font. Then we have the alignment and placement of the font, the color, how the buttons look. And as I scroll, we have kind of a different layout down here, and then a further layout down here. Let's look at another page. So this is the Uber case study rebranding page. Uber rebranded this year after a lot of controversy and trying to basically find their way from competitors such as Lyft. So here we have another web page that has very intense hierarchy. Right? They're really trying to lead our eye in a very specific way. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. Here's Fedex's website. This is a much more conservative style of site, right? Just as far as hierarchy goes. So with the Netflix page, we have our landing page. It's all sort of centrally oriented, and then as we scroll down and get to more information, it breaks into this like 3-column selection, and then below that we have a single column just basically displaying the content and the information. And then at the very bottom we have these little pieces down here. So this is kind of split into a header, the central body, and then finally the footer. Let's look at the Fedex website. We have this top bar, which stays kind of glued to our page as we scroll around. This would be called a nav bar or a navigation menu, right? So this helps us navigate around the website. Then we have our central content, right? It's broken up into columns or rows, 3 columns down here. And then finally a footer, which looks extremely similar to the Netflix footer, right? You're going to see that there's certain trends in web design that are used again and again and again. Let's look at the Uber rebrand. Scroll all the way down to the bottom, and we have a footer. Now this one's a little bit more designed or a little more unique than the others, but you can still see that. Okay, so that all makes sense, right? Pretty basic information, and this all kind of applies to print and publication as well as web design. Let's go to our next thing, which is interaction design. Okay, so there's things that are clickable and things that aren't clickable. So if I click this text, nothing happens. But if I click this text, well, it's going to reload the page. If I click this button, it's going to sign in. This will try a 30-day trial. So this is identifying what's clickable and what's not clickable. Right, so this, not clickable, this, clickable. This is really important when we're thinking about layout and design, because we want to essentially have our users clicking on things, right? Clicks are really important. That means that they're engaging with the site. That's the way that we measure engagement typically, is based on clicks, or if it's a video content site, minutes viewed. So in this case though, we care about clicks, right? We want them to click on this 30-day free trial. So what do? We have this huge red border around it that identifies, hey, this is clickable. We're so accustomed to the internet that we know this probably isn't clickable because there's no kind of border or what we'd call a button around it. But this, we know it's clickable because it has a button, and furthermore, whenever we move our mouse over it, right, our mouse changes to this little like Mickey Mouse hand. And lastly, what else is happening? There's a subtle color shift, right? So it's slightly darker, now it's slightly lit up. This is called the hover state. H-O-V-E-R, hover. I'm hovering my mouse over this right now, and so it's in this state. Whenever I'm off of it, this is the default state. And then whenever I click it, so I'm just clicking and holding right now, this is the clicked state. We usually talk about web design in a sort of form of states, right? So we say, okay, so we have this landing page, here's the hover states, here's the click states, whenever I release. All right, here's the next page, here's the hover state, the static state or the default state, and then the click state. They're all a little bit different. This is because interaction, right, is reliant on the mouse in this case. So we have to talk about it in this kind of abstract way of like hovering, clicking. We also have hover states for these links, right? The little underline, that's telling us, hey, you can click these. Can't click these images though, right? Nothing changes. This, we have them kind of illuminate. And the one that we currently have selected has this red bar under it. So again, we're changing states. And we understand that visually. Let's go to the Uber Rebrand site. As I start to scroll, in this case, the scrolling is actually the interaction. So none of this is really clickable. But as I scroll, it kind of animates. There's things to look at, right? So as I scroll down, and I could click these, and it'll take me to that part of the page. Right, animation. So this engagement is very different. This is a much more active engagement because it's essentially encouraging me to keep scrolling. So rather than encouraging clicks, like the Netflix, right? With Netflix we want them to try our service. We want them to pay for our service. This is more of an informational website. We want them to be inspired by our service or be interested in our service. So it's less about interaction, less about clicking, and more about scrolling, right? Wants me to keep reading. The Fedex page does the same thing. This button, large and highlighted, and whenever I move my mouse over here and click, it switches. Let me go back. This nav bar, we have a navigation menu here. Whenever I click, this is called a drop-down menu. Right, this is giving me information. This is clickable because it has this kind of rounded side. This isn't clickable. So this is helping us identify what is and isn't interactive on the site. All right, so interaction and this concept of the hover versus the click versus the default state. So state-based interactions, really important for web design. Lastly, we want to talk about call to actions or really like forms, basically. So how do we tell people, hey, you can type something here. I can type in my tracking ID. Well, whenever I click, it moves that tracking ID over there. If I go to the sign up page, whenever I click, right, it moves this and it highlights it, telling me where my cursor is. So this is another type of interaction that's a little bit different than the click-based or scroll-based interactions. This one is based on us filling out information. If we go to Google, we have the same thing. Right? With Google, by default, it highlights this. Whenever I click off of it, it's no longer highlighted. Whenever I click, now it has that drop shadow, and my cursor's flashing. So this is our kind of call to action. It's telling us, hey, start typing in something. They have this great hover effect here on the I'm feeling lucky button that I think is really interesting. It's kind of like a little slot machine. And then lastly, the last thing I want to talk about is vertical design. Right? And this is very, very different than what you might be used to in print and publication. Print and publication design, you're often working with pages that you're reading left to right, right? And you're turning a page, and you're kind of going through each piece of content. In web design, and this is pretty much how it's always been, because of the limitations of HTML, it's a vertical design, right? We want people to scroll. It's pretty common that people have scroll wheels, or they're used to two-finger scrolling on their trackpads. It's very uncommon to have left and right scrolling, right? To scroll to the left and to the right, like using the bottom bar, is very uncomfortable, and users don't usually like to do it. So we have to rethink horizontal design and instead recontextualize it as vertical design, right? One of the big design trends over the last couple of years has been single-page websites, where it's just one massive page that we scroll through. And whenever we click, it jumps us to different parts of that one single scrolling page. Right? This is heavily influenced by phones. Smartphones have really changed how web design works and how we think about web design. And so now we kind of adapt our stuff to smartphones because a lot of users only use smartphones to browse the internet. They don't use laptops or computers. So we think about, okay, scrolling, right? Scrolling with our thumb. It's very easy to just kind of scroll up with your thumb while you're holding your phone. It's very difficult to scroll side to side. I find it very hard on Instagram, for instance, to scroll through an album of pictures. It's kind of a pain. It's much easier to just scroll continuously.